everyone. My name is Gergely MOHÁCSI. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Osaka University. Most of my work is in the field of medical anthropology and science and technology studies, which many of you probably are familiar with. But I'm also affiliated with the department. It's called Kyosei Studies, which is coexistence in Japanese. And probably at the end of my talk, I'm going to return to this for a brief moment. Another thing that I wanted to tell you about myself is that I really love experimental arts, films and music and performance and everything in between. And partly my presentation today and my talk today will be touching up on this topic of experimentation and tinkering. Not the artsy kind, but more the gardening kind. So let me start my talk. Most of the human stories I tell in my ethnographic work is about disease and how to live with disease. For many years, I've been following scientists and healthcare workers and patients of diabetes in Japan. And more recently, I work with environmental activists and herbal gardeners in Vietnam and in Western Japan. So spending time with patients of chronic disease makes you realize that the central role of pharmaceuticals and other chemical substances for humans to stay healthy is very, very important in terms of telling their stories. We have to stay healthy and you need a lot of, sometimes when you're sick, you need pharmaceuticals and medications to stay healthy and share your stories. And another important thing that that we often miss out or take for granted is that much of these human and social worlds are entangled with other living beings, like experimental animals that need to be for us to test our pharmaceuticals, or plants that many of our pharmaceuticals are derived from. So healing human disease, even with chemical substances, is a multi-species story in itself, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So one interesting and for some worrying aspect of this multi-species entanglement is the way pharmaceuticals leak into the environment. Ecological and public health research from all around the world report that rivers and groundwaters, not to mention sewage systems in urban areas, are filled with pharmaceutical waste. Some of them are unmetabolized or disposed medications, antidepressants and anti-influenza drugs flushing through our bodies. And some of them, others are uncontrolled waste of antibiotics or contraceptives leaking from drug manufacturing plants. The drugs that we use to treat human suffering are now blending into the ecological habitat of fish, birds, and other small animals, triggering behavioral and psychological responses from them. So it is in this sense that drug development is now a sort of social ecological system of sort of kind. The report that you can see on the screen is recently published by Healthcare Without Harm. It shows that how pharmaceutical residues in hospital wastewaters in Europe turn medical infrastructures into the hotbeds of drug resistance. So this is now a relatively well-known fact and a well-researched area, but mostly from the human point of view. The question is then how we can build more resilient medical systems. In the literature, there are three common answers to this question. One is that we can try to repair our infrastructures or help wastewater treatment to filter out these toxic materials from our sewage systems. That's a kind of a technological fix, you could say. The other one is developing pharmaceuticals, for example, biodegradable drugs in the long term, but it seems to be very, very difficult and takes a very, very long time. The third one, and the one that in the remaining part of my talk I want to focus on, is perhaps the least obvious one. It is the cultivating of more than human entanglements in something that I will call grassroots medicine. So this is something that I would like to focus on in the remaining part of my talk. So the place that I would like to introduce to you shortly now in the remaining part of my talk is a small town in Nara Prefecture in Western Japan that you can see on the right side of the slide on the map. This area has not only been an ancient site for gathering medicinal plants, both for locals and Japanese, and also even for the Japanese emperor a long time ago, but also later in the 18th and 19th century, this town became a hub for processing crude drugs and selling these drugs to pharmacies located in Osaka, Kyoto, and other big cities in Western Japan. One of these medicinal plants is the root called Yamato Toki that you can see in the middle of the photo, in the middle of the slide. And this is also cultivated today by locals in this area. There's also a historical herbal garden in the middle of the town, which attests to the long and diverse history of living together with medicinal plants and also medicinal products in this area. But today, I will introduce to you another garden, not so far from this historical garden, actually on the other side of the main road that leads through the town. And I'm going to introduce you I will introduce you this small garden and how it was established and how it is managed. And I'm trying to think of this small garden as an example of what I call grassroots medicine. This garden is much more recent than the historical one that I talked about in the previous slide. And the plants cultivated here are actually not for sale. It's only for the use of the people who grow them in the garden. It is something that I usually, when I talk about my research, I describe this as a community herbal garden because it was established by local residents and it's mainly managed by local residents. But it is also a place for social mixing between newcomers looking for more sustainable lifestyles in remote areas in Japan, and also the locals who are eager to share their stories and techniques of cultivating medicinal plants with new members. The garden was established on the remains of a former paddy field. So interestingly, it's also kind of an environmental tinkering of trying to regenerate the eroded soil of this former paddy field and trying to create a new ecosystem on the ruins of this former paddy field. They also, of course, because this part of the this area is famous for medicinal plants and the production and manufacturing of crude drugs. Obviously, there are many local plants, and of course, one aim of this garden is to preserve and cultivate these local medicinal plants. But at the same time, members are very interested in tinkering with new kinds of herbs from outside of Japan or other parts of Japan. And they're trying to learn how to cultivate them, and they're trying to learn new ways of using them for their. So also, it's very important that this garden is a place where people can learn about the impact of human health on the environment, because they are cultivating plants that they use for their own health. But at the same time, they also learn about how to cultivate and how to grow these plants and what are the environmental and ecological impacts of those plants. Especially as part of regenerating the soil of this former paddy field. So this is not necessarily by taking lessons in the toxic effects of pharmaceutical pollutants. They're not learning about the effects of pharmaceutical pollutants. but they are constructing the space where plants and humans cohabit each other's worlds. And in that sense, actually, it is a lot of learning involved in the process of managing and cultivating medicinal plants. A lot of learning about the environmental impact of human health that is directly related to the issues of pharmaceutical health, pollution that I was talking about in the first part of my talk. And actually, this kind of tinkering and experimenting with medicinal plants, it kind of reminds me the work of Natasha Meyers, an STS scholar, who, writing about gardens in the Anthropocene, says, let me quote her directly. So she says, alongside farms, forests, and plantations, gardens are crucial sites for examining the more than human dimensions of social, political, and economic life, offering profound insights into forms of governance, political economy, and ecology, industry, labor, and more. So gardens are sites where people explicitly stage and restage human relationship with nature. Let me just unquote it. Let me repeat this. Gardens are sites where people explicitly stage and restage human relationship with nature. In community herbal gardens and grassroots medicine, to make it a bit more specific, people stage and restage human relationship with health and disease, and other living creatures like plants, of course. Which is also to say that they learn to live and heal and grow together with medicinal plants. So this is exactly what the Japanese term kyosei is used to describe, a form of symbiosis or living together, for example, with medicinal plants or pharmaceuticals. Quite interestingly, this originally more or less vernacular Japanese term, because of the growing concern with ecological crisis, kind of this term transformed into a concept in Japanese social and human sciences that allows political activists and researchers to broaden the scope of politics to encompass non-human entities and materiality, like pharmaceuticals and medicinal plants. So let me use this concept of kyosei to briefly wrap up my talk and tell you about what we can learn about, what kyosei tells us about people today when we think through medicinal plants and pharmaceuticals. First, medicinal plants can show us the interimplication of plants, human bodies, and the future of a less toxic planet. Second, in gardens where medicinal plants are cultivated, we find the co-constitution of human and other stories in an open-ended tinkering and care, and probably an alternative to over-medication as well. And finally, kyosei itself, well, it probably allows us to see that the coexistence of many different worlds is not an imaginary common good, but more or less something like an ongoing experimentation or tinkering or trying to live together with plants and other living creatures, and even medications that help us to become healthier. So it is perhaps this experimenting with new forms of togetherness or kyosei that makes us more than human and makes our stories also more than human. Thank you very much for watching this, and also I would like to thank all the members of the Herbal Community Garden that I introduced to you in this short talk. Thank you, and enjoy the other talks and human stories. Thank you.
Peace and light to you and yours. So I sometimes do this and do that.